So today the tea we're going to drink is a祁門red tea. So on your package it should say 祁門紅茶, Qimenhongcha. It should be in a little red packet. And let me show you this tea. By the way, we're also going to use the Gaiwan in the strainer and the fairness pitcher set to brew the tea. Get your teapot ready and make sure your water is boiled. Yeah. Cool. So now let's first take a look at the tea leaves. I have it ready on a tea lotus. So, obviously when you have the tea at home, you can just look at your own tea. You'll notice that it has a very skinny string. This is because the picking grade for a red tea is more tender than the picking grade for the two oolongs that we had in the past 2 days. So even though they're both string shape, however, this is skinnier, right? It's smaller. I also want to, I should probably mention that by red tea, we really mean black tea in the West, and I'll go into that in a second. And you can feel free to smell the tea as well. And the tea does not really smell like much. It has a little bit of sweetness in the aroma, right? So sometimes if you have a tea that you're not sure, it looks like a darker colored tea, which a lot of teas are when they're dried, and especially has some oxidation or roastiness. But one thing to tell if it's a red tea or not, obviously, is to see the size or the girth of the dried tea leaves. But you can also smell the tea, and if it has a little bit of a sweetness in the aroma, you can be sure it's a red tea instead of a oolong. Alright? So the red tea I was mentioning is really what's called black tea in the West. This is because in China we have another category of tea called black tea, which we'll taste in the next 2 days. It's completely different two kinds of tea, and we've had a black tea for over 1,000 years, so it's not fair for us to change the name to the black tea in the West. And also, this is not just China. In a lot of East Asian countries, we do the same thing. So red tea by definition is a fully fermented tea. And usually, when we think of a black tea, we think of something that's pretty astringent. You kind of need to add sugar and milk to it, or you add lemon and sugar to it to make the tea a little bit more drinkable. However, it's because the tea was made very poorly. If you make the red tea very well, by definition, it's actually the sweetest category of tea. It's very mellow, very easy to drink, it's full-bodied, and the tannins is on a finer level, even though you still have tannins, but it's not very astringent at all. It's a very, very drinkable tea, especially when you sometimes want to drink tea, but you do not want to pay too much attention to the tea. You kind of want like a background tea. Then both white tea and red tea are very good choices. It's very, it's like a mild temperament enough for us to drink them every day. There are many different styles of red teas that you can have. Usually it depends on it's heavily correlated with the location the tea comes from. This is a red tea that comes from祁門. You have probably heard the English name for it is祁門, Keemun. Sometimes if you buy English breakfast, you can turn to the back of the package and then see the ingredient. They'll even say ingredient祁門. But it's really just talking about how they have the original tea trees that were planted in祁門, and they use those cultivars to make the tea. Real祁門needs to come from the township in China that's actually called祁門or祁門. So before I go into more detail, let's brew the tea first. The standard brewing size for red tea for Gaiwan, for this style of Gaiwan, which is 7 grams for Dantong, 8 grams for cliff tea, and it's 5 grams for a red tea. So red tea, remember we're talking about how there are certain teas you have to use boiling temperature, such as oolong, and certain teas that you have to not use boiling temperature, like green yellow tea. Now this is and you have other teas kind of in between that you don't have to use boiling temperature, even though it's preferred to use hotter temperature, but it's a little bit more forgiving during the brewing, and this is one of those teas. So I would prefer if you use boiling, but if it's just off boiling, that's fine too. Also during the brewing workshop, remember we're talking about how sometimes you want to leave a slightly larger opening of the gaiwan so the water can come out more smoothly and faster. But sometimes you want to have a smaller opening if the tea leaves are smaller and you do not want all the tea leaves to fall out when you brew the tea. This is one of those. So you do want to make sure that you do not have too big an opening, but not too small either. Because if you have too small opening, then the water gets pushed to the side or it has problem coming out and it can burn your finger. All right. Again, we're aiming for speed, so you want to go around the gaiwan, put the lid on, strainer on, brush open, grab, and pour. Make sure you pour on the edge of the strainer to make the movement very gradual. Okay. Put the gaiwan down, smell the lid. Oh, this tea smells so good. This literally smells like honey and rose, and this kind of very lavish aroma is signature for a祁門, or in Chinese we call it 祁紅, shortened for 祁門紅茶, because祁門equals 祁門, Hong cha equals red tea, so we say 祁紅. That's basically the abbreviation for 祁門紅茶. All right. So let's try a sip of the rinse. So I would say immediately I noticed is how smooth this tea is, right? And also with the smoothness, it still comes with quite a substantial body. And it seems to be sweet. And the sweetness will come out even more as you brew the tea a little bit. As you brew the tea more, the sweetness will come out more as well. So this sweetness is distinctly different from the sweetness that you have experienced in green tea, which a lot of sweetness comes from the aftertaste. And then for the oolong, a lot of sweetness is in the aroma. This is actual sweetness. And what you're tasting is a very, very minute amount of sugar that gets synthesized during the making of red tea. Right, so you can give the rest to the teapot. Right. And now let's brew the first brew. You put the strainer on. You want to brush open, grab, pour the tea out onto the strainer. Put it down. You smell the lid. All right, let's try the first brew. I'm gonna guess it's gonna be more floral now the tea opens up. So there are a lot of more substantial taste now to this particular brew. It is a little bit more tannic, so it's less round as the rinse brew. And that natural sweetness definitely comes through. Also keep in mind the honey quality sometimes also comes a little bit as the tea becomes slightly older, but you do not want the red tea to be too old. As time go by, not only it will start to lose its aroma, it'll become earthier, but also it might become sour in certain circumstance. But this one is from 2015, and right now that honey and rose quality is so amazing. All right. So location. So we were talking about how a real祁門needs to come from the township of祁門. Now within祁門there are several.祁門is actually a city. It's a county level city. So it's a secondary city, not like a big city kind of city. And then so the within祁門there are actually several townships that's known for their particular characteristic in the tea. Depends on what kind of terroir they have. The most well known is a township called Likou. Within Likou, there is a village called Lixi. And you probably guess this is a red tea that comes from Lixi. So on a normalized circumstance, Lixi raw leaf always sells for the most price. So it is one of the most desired location. Not only that, Lixi is also an amazing ancient village. So within the village, there are a lot of old buildings, and the village were known for to be the birthplace of several royal doctors back in the days as well. So they have these very interesting artifacts about the interaction between the emperor and then the doctors in the village and things like that. And then you can even see the old docking location where the ships will come by and then pick up the tea and then send the tea to a seaport and then later on for exportation. So it's a very interesting village to visit. I wouldn't say go to China just for that, because it is a small village, but if you happen to be in the Qimen area, make sure you do not miss a trip going to the village of the village of Lixi. The Qimen is actually part of the Yellow Mountain Range. So we haven't really talked about the Yellow Mountain Range, but it's an amazing mountain. If you ever go to China, there's one natural scenery you go to, I would personally highly endorse Yellow Mountain. There's several famous teas produced on the Yellow Mountain Range. They all are very umami. So the umami savory sense of flavor is the signature attribute of the teas that produce in the Yellow Mountain Range. The Yellow Mountain Range that's part of the Qimen is actually a natural scenery destination as well. I have actually never paid a ticket to go into the top tourist attraction there. I've only been to the tea area. It's called Gu Niu Jiang, but it's also a natural forest that's probably worth visiting if you're in the area. So Qimen, if you really smell in the aroma, you can definitely detect that little bit umami, almost like a meat kind of flavor to it. So once again, you can either finish your tea or you can pour your tea into a separate cup. So you can have the tea later. Okay. Now I'm going to brew the second brew of the tea. Like the floral note in the Qimen is very different from the floral note that we have experienced in the oolongs, right? It's a little bit, it's almost like it's a deeper floral note. I would say rose is definitely a very accurate description for this kind of floweriness. Versus for oolong, a lot of them have like an orchid kind of floralness, especially for the lighter fermented oolong. Sometimes you even have like a jasmine aroma, which is very fresh kind of floral. Okay. Now let's try the second brew for a Qimen. This is a particularly good year for Lixi, by the way. The tea was very sweet from Lixi. Very umami, like it's almost like it has a slight dash of MSG to it, and it makes you salivate as you drink the tea. All right, so we talk about the location, and remember for any true origin teas, you have location, varietal, and processing. Earlier today, we actually posted a short video of another township called Ruokeng. In the Qimen area, so you can see what a good terroir actually looks like. And then keep in mind, for all top teas, they all need to come from a terroir that features this kind of biodiversity, right? So it's not a plantation tea that we are presenting here. All right, and then let's talk a little bit about varietal. So the region, they still have given that it's a traditional region, they will have heirloom varietal, which is the style of this kind of varietal is called Chu Ye. But just keep in mind, these are a lot of the teas are still heirloom varietal. But in the region, they do have one clone that's very commonly used. As with all clone, we usually produce a tea that's a little bit lighter, but it has higher yield. It's more consistent or uniform in the fresh picked leaves instead of in terms of their harvesting time and their picking sizes. So it's a little easier to process, which could result in if a more uniform output is if one does not have the skill to manage the different sizes and shapes of heirloom varietal. So it helps if there's a lot of human errors involved. And that clone varietal is called the Huang Shan #1. So red flag #1, that's the name of the clone varietal commonly for a祁門. Right. And then let's talk about the processing. I'm actually going to put the second brew aside as well, and then do another brew. So this will be the third brew. I always try to do 3 or 4 brews on screen, and then have you finish the tea at home. All right. And red tea can last for a long time. This tea can last well past 10 brews. Do not be afraid to let the tea steep for a little longer for the later brews, especially you want to brew the tea for a little longer, I would say 3 to 5 seconds longer once they pass the 6th brew. And if you already reach like 8 or 9 brew, you can let the tea sit for even a little longer. This tea, as they finish it off, it'll become it'll kind of have a very gradual exit, and it'll eventually have a very unique kind of sweetness. It's quite diluted, it's a lack of depth, but it's still very pleasant. That's why a lot of people like to keep brewing their red tea until the flavor is completely exhausted. Okay, so let's try this third brew. All right. So let's talk about the processing of red tea. Personally, I love making red tea because it's very, very challenging. I would say making red tea, so making tea or brewing tea, they both very much like cooking. You gotta know your ingredients, right? You basically have moisture and heat at your moisture, heat, and time. That's the 3 things that you are manipulating in order to manipulating the taste of the tea. And red tea is more or less almost like baking. The reason it's so challenging is is because it has very few steps. So if you mess up one step, it's very difficult to make up for what you have missed. When we have the red tea picked, it's usually nowadays people also make single butt red tea, but just keep in mind this is a new style of red tea. So 20 years ago, you do not have this style of red tea. So red tea, the traditional picking grade will be a butt in 1 leaf or a butt in 2 leaves. Once you pick the tea, you do let the tea wilt for a while. You can do this under normal conditions. If you do that under normal conditions, you're looking at about 12 hours of wilting, which is a very, very long time. But if you do this with some with an oxidation bed, with the wind blowing and some heat, so which is very, very common now for making red tea, you can do this within even an hour if you don't want quality tea. But even with the oxidation bed, you still want it between 4 to 7 hours if you want very, very good results with the tea. So what you want to achieve is a point where the tea is completely malleable. So you take a piece of the looks like pretty beat up fresh leaves, and you can put it on your hand and you roll it. When you roll it, if it starts to crumble, that means there's still too much moisture in the tea, and the tea need to continue to sit for it to lose moisture. But once it loses enough moisture, it basically has elasticity, and you can roll the tea. So after the tea is ready, you do take the tea out and you roll the tea. For For red tea, we're looking at a rolling period that's the longest among all teas. If you pick a bud in 2 leaves, we're looking at about an hour of rolling time, which is a very long time. But you want to roll the tea pretty gently, because what we want is to break the membranes of the tea leaves to expose the tea to oxygen even more. So we're looking for the exposure to oxygen of the tea, but you do not want to break the tea. So pressure is very important during this rolling process. And after you do that, so all this time that we were doing the picking, the wilting, the rolling, it's all just to prepare the tea for the fermentation. So then you put the tea into these containers. Nowadays you can still have the woven bamboo baskets, or sometimes people would have these stainless steel ones for larger facilities. You put the tea and you pile it up to a certain height. How high you pile the tea up really has a lot to do with the overall size of the tea, and because you usually want to make sure the center is a little thinner. This is because the heat will be generated just by the mass alone. So what you want to do is to make sure it's not overheating in the center. So it really depends on how big the container is. You want to adjust the height of the tea as well. And you cover it with a wet towel. You can either do it in room temperature with some very primitive measurements to control heat and moisture, which I'll offer you a trick that my monk friend used. Or you can use actual fermentation machines or rooms, which are these building machineries that can regulate the heat and the moisture. And the best ones needs to have a oxygen inlet and outlet, so it can control the flow of the fresh air. So if you want to do it at room temperature, then you just have to be careful that it's away from wind, because otherwise it will dry the tea and it will fail to maintain the desired moisture that you want the tea to ferment at. Or if you actually the temperature is so cold, you are also looking at a really, really long fermentation process. And remember that linger time can decrease the moisture in the tea as well. So you have to figure out the method to balance the two out. What my monk friend does, so at Tea Drunk we have a red tea that's made by a monk friend of mine, and what he does is he actually built like these little shed, and it's 3 sides has wood, and then this one side he would just use a plastic, and then he nailed the plastic on to maintain the moisture in. He'll put in this small little shed a charcoal bin, so it's a smokeless charcoal obviously, to maintain the heat, and then he'll sprinkle water on the floor to create moisture, and then the tea basket then sit in this kind of makeshift room, and it works pretty good. And then sometimes if you need airflow and stuff, you can just open up the plastic doorway, and then that'll help to facilitate some airflow as well. It takes some careful observation on the tea during the making, and then some experience, but this is actually a great way to make up for not having a fancy fermentation machine. So the reason making red tea is so challenging is you cannot really take the tea out and then do things with it while it ferments, and this fermentation time depends on the red tea that you make, will take 4 to 8 hours. So during this time, all you can do is basically just wait. And then once that time is over, you take the tea out, and it's either fermented or it's not fermented well. So I would say it's very much like cooking. Oh my God, every time I bake bread or cake, it's like I never know if it's gonna come out all right or not. So something like that for the red tea. It takes a lot of experience to know how to prepare the tea prior to fermentation, and then so you do not have to always guess what the result will be. And you do not want to over ferment the tea, because if you over ferment the tea can be sour, it can start to have funky notes. That's not what we want. Ideally, once you take the tea out, they should all look a light brown color. And For best practice, we oftentimes actually pick out the discolorated ones because you're always gonna have some kind of uneven fermentation. This is very, very tedious. We usually, use chopsticks and then do this for many, many minutes, and you gotta do it kind of fast. And after a while, everything looks so everything looks the same to your eyes because this is a very eye training practice, but it's very necessary. And after that, so for Kimen, I'm only going to talk about the steps about Kimen. What you want to do is actually you want to heat the tea up for a little bit. So this is to help dry the tea, and it also helps to stabilize the tea further before the tea goes on baking. So to make this particular style of Kimen, which I'll offer you in just a second, you want to just put it in the wok and at a pretty low heat, and then just flip the tea. So it's very much similar to how you do the wok kill green for green tea, but you do this with red tea, and then you'll see the steam start to leave the tea, and then when the tea feel a little bit dry on the outside, but you know it's not completely dry inside, then this is the time where you start baking the tea. We usually bake them twice, again, to make sure it's completely dried but not overheated. And for all traditional teas, remember you have to sort the tea to pick out the stems and the yellow leaves. And then also what you need to do is the step to enhance the aroma. And this usually had to wait a few weeks after you've finished the primary processing of the tea. And this is a very risky step. Oftentimes what I taste in very inferior red tea is this chocolate note or cacao note. So this is the note that happens when you overfire the tea leaves, and it basically homogenizes all the other tasting notes. The reason it's a very bad notes in tea is because no matter what terroir it comes from, no matter what varietal it is, no matter how much the preparation work you have done into processing the tea, now all of them are gonna taste the same because you have one single overpowering note, which is this chocolate note. And it's very easy to achieve. You only require you to bake the tea at a slightly higher temperature, and then you literally caramelize the sugar in the tea, and this is how you achieve that flavor. So it's a very tricky step that you want to make sure you do not give the tea any additional flavor, but instead you're enhancing the aroma, repel any impurities in the tea, and also solidify all the notes in the tea. Now in the Kimen area, back in the days, people do make a gongfu tea. So this is distinctly different from this brewing style. It's referring to a style of tea making. Long story short, it involves numerous repeated steps of sorting, beating the tea in the back to break the tea in a very natural way, and then sorting it again. So you actually have broken tea, but this broken tea is very different from now the manufactured tea where just chop the tea. It's actually the most traditional way to making Kimen, and all the people who know how to do this are very old now. So this is the last generation that you can still have very, very small amount of this tea, and it's one of the rarest Kimens you can find in the market now, actually. And then if the whole leaf Kimen, like this one, it can take several different shapes, and they're usually copied after green tea shapes. So you can have a tea without the shape making, because shape making needs to be deliberately done. So rolling the tea, but without the intent to make a shape, that's not shape making. So when you roll the tea and then you don't have additional shape making in the tea, and you just kind of let the tea take on whatever shape that as a result, that's a maofeng. So that's why this particular Kimen is called a Hong maofeng. You can also roll the tea into a spiral shape, mimicking the green tea Bülochun. Then you'll have a tea called Hong Xiangluo. You can also have a Kimen that you actually adopt this motion during the shape making, and mimicking a Chinese green tea called Songluo, and you get Hong Song Luo. So these are the very common ones that you can have. And nowadays, in just very recent years, Kimen area, people also start to roll the tea into needle shape. So very similar to a gyokru. And then you're gonna have a 就是红松针. So it's a needle shape red tea. So you can have all these different shapes, and then you further name your Kimen after these shapes. All right. So I was so afraid we're gonna get network problem again, so I really want to hurry through the things. But now let's take some questions. I'm going to bring the phone closer to me so I can see the questions. All right. So I'm gonna first review the questions in which step do you shape the tea? So during making the red tea, because all red tea has to be rolled, so we do not shape red tea just during the rolling process. The tea is actually shaped after the fermentation, and depends on what style of shape that you want to achieve, then you can further roll the tea into that shape, because the tea is still not dried yet, it's still malleable. Next question. Do you bake tea with charcoal? Yes. The most traditional way of making Chinese tea is wood fire and charcoal. Charcoal is always preferred, but charcoal is very expensive. So charcoal is usually reserved for baking the tea. During the initial firing the tea, if you want to achieve your high temperature for killing the enzymes in tea, it's still very, very commonly use wood fire. It sounds fancy, but in rural China, log woods are very abundant, and people actually cook with wood fire as well. We start to see in the recent years people moving away from that. It doesn't have a very high requirement on the chimney requirement, so you do not have smoke that goes into tea. But charcoal is still preferred, especially if you're baking or roasting the tea. After rolling the tea, do you separate the tea before piling the tea? Yes. So every time you roll the tea, you always want to make sure you completely break up any knots. Sometimes when the tea is not rolled very well, because the tea is, especially for good tea, the teas are very, very sticky. And then what's going to happen is you're going to have these tiny little balls of tea, and you literally have to use your finger to break them apart. Depends on the batch that you're making. Sometimes people also just forgo these balls, because if they come out finish rolling already with the ball shape, that means they're probably not going to ferment anyway, and it'll create more work sorting the tea out later. So if you can afford it, I would just actually pick the whole ball out. But if you're doing this in between the rolling, and then you roll the tea, you take it out, and then you put it back, then which means you still have a chance to save these tea, I would break it apart. And then you also have bigger lumps, you want to break it apart as well. And then you pile the tea up again. So even when we pile the tea into the steps, you actually do them in layers, because you want to make sure it's packed, but it's not packed tight. It still has some air. Since we're talking about red tea, can you talk about Jinjunmei and what makes it super expensive? Yes, so this really has to do with the history of red tea. So red tea as a category was a tea that really became popular due to exportation need at the time. So for a long time, Chinese people, we actually do not drink red tea. And we all know that we basically don't export the good stuff. So this caused the domestic market, the connoisseurs that are so used to drinking very expensive green tea, not have a high regards for the red tea, and that's why for the longest time, red tea does not demand very high price. However, even if it's a mass-produced tea, after 150 years, you got plenty of time to refine your technique and things like that. One of the reasons that people used to offer their opinion on why red tea people do not consider very sophisticated is because they think the picking is too rough. So that's when the single bud red tea, which is Jinjunmei, was invented. Now, it's very expensive. Number one is actually because of its location. It comes from Tongmu, which, remember, is China's most exclusive tea region. It's also the home for Zhengshan Xiaozhong or Lapsan Sichuan. Even though this is a tea that's, I think the name is relatively familiar with people, but just like with so many traditional Chinese tea, their majority of the teas are knockoffs. It's not the actual Zhengshan Xiaozhong that come from the natural reserve area. So Jinju may already come from this very impressive location, and it uses single butt only, and it also because of some really awesome marketing at the time. So it is a tea that single-handedly rebranded the whole red tea image. So a lot of the other red tea like Kimen, which is have much to do with Jinju Mei, also enjoy the benefit of increased domestic demand because Jinju Mei really got tea connoisseurs' attention with it being a single butt red tea. All right. Is the different tea shape making the red tea taste differently? Is there any effect on the flavor? Yes. So every tiny thing that we do can always change the taste of the tea. And as a general rule, the more you rub a tea, so the more aggressive you had to make the shape of the tea. Usually it's a tea with a tighter shape because you had to rub the tea a little bit more. The more intense the flavor will become. And the less you need to rub the tea, the more subtle notes, so the notes that usually results from the amino acid in tea, which is a lot of umami note, will come in the tea that's rubbed a little less. Can you age Longjing for drinking? Well, technically, you can't really age green tea because green tea has been treated with very high temperature, and it's also a tea that has a higher tendency to oxidize. So over time, the flavor will change, but it will change in a very singular way. So it'll just become having a more and more oxidized taste. But to be fair, I know a lot of people actually do like oxidized green tea taste just because it's a little bit less fresh, and in a way it's also a little bit less astringent, but keep in mind it's not considered desired. So when you drink the tea, you can always have whatever preference, right? Especially if your preference does not demand a very high price, then I actually think it's a very good thing. But at the same time, also make sure that you're not overpaying for a note that's not considered desired as a collectively. So that's kind of the thing. So if you want, yeah, feel free to drink an older Longjing. I actually really like my green tea the winter after. It's very good. What is Hei Cha? Is it within the red tea category? So Hei Cha is what Chinese is the Chinese pronunciation for black tea. So no, Hei Cha, it would be a Chinese black tea, which we'll go over next time. What is the proper way to cook and store shopu? So I'm not sure like what do you mean by to cook, but to store all teas, you definitely want it to be away from moisture. That's number one, very important. And then number two, away from any air that has a smell. So I would say kitchen is not a very good place to store the tea. And when in doubt, you can always store the tea in the airtight container. You cannot go wrong with an airtight container. If you want your tea to have a little air, you want it to develop either a little bit more earthy note for the pour, you can wrap it in rice paper and then put it in a paper bag if you want. Or if you have any clay jars or containers, you can put the tea in those as well. All right. So let's look at the other questions. You mentioned the adding of sugar for this tea. Can you go a bit more into it? Or a bit into more. So we actually do not add sugar to this particular tea when we're drinking the tea. However, when we fully ferment the tea, it'll naturally have sugar. So So which is very different, right? So it'll naturally synthesize a little bit of sugar. It's a very, very minute amount. So that's what gives you a little sweeter feeling of the tea, and it's more actual sweetness versus like a more abstract sweetness. However, normally when Chinese we drink tea, we do not add sugar to the tea. But if you want, you can add a little bit of sugar and milk to this tea. I do believe that for any tea, if it's a better tea, it'll always taste better given everything else equals. But keep in mind, for a lot of better tea, because the tannins are very fine, it does have a problem standing up to the roughness of the dairy, which what you can do is you can shake the tea to facilitate a more thorough binding of the catechin in the tea with the protein in the milk. This will give you a little bit stronger body. How can the name Lapsang Souchong is used when it's not the real thing? You're probably talking about labeling issues, I will assume. Well, that's just because I guess a lack of reinforcement. Sometimes I joke with my tea friends, in China, there's no mediocre tea. You either have really bad tea or have really good tea. But it's actually not true. There are a lot of mediocre tea. But what happens is the mediocre tea will either pretend to be very good tea, or they will have to enter the price competition with really bad tea. So as a result, it's like no one is willing to come out to say that this is an okay tea and I'm selling it a fair and okay price. So that's probably why. And the so Lapsang Souchong was such a very famous tea. The knockoffs are just everywhere. Usually, if you have a Lapsang Souchong that's very, very smoky, sometimes you can even see the gloss from the oil on the tea leaves, and that's usually not a actual Lapsang Souchong. How much Chinese pu'er is actually imported from Vietnam? I actually do not have any actual stats of that, but but I know that not only in Vietnam, but also in Thailand and in Laos, a lot of people are making pu'er style tea, and they would either export it to the West or sell it to China. So that's definitely a thing, yeah. But also keep in mind there are two sides for making pu'er in not in Yunnan, but in the nation that's the borders, the province of Yunnan. This is really because people are either actually looking for older tea trees. So some of the areas in these nations, they actually have older tea trees. So people are literally just looking for alternative place to have tea coming from older tea trees that still haven't been heavily exploited, or still the price is still more affordable for somebody who is doing the wholesale on the tea. But also at the same time, you have people who are simply looking for a greater volume, a greater production for a cheaper price, and then trying to sell the tea as something that it's not. So it's not like all the teas that's produced not from Yunnan but sold as pu'er has the intention of being a knockoff. Just that's the point. Yeah. My white porcelain teaware is getting stained on the bottom. How do you get the stains out? Does it matter? Yes, I would definitely recommend always wash the teaware really well after you use the tea, and also keep in mind the lower oxidized tea, like green tea, actually stains teaware more than anything else. You can either use baking soda to rub the tea, which take a little effort, or you can put a little bleach into the teaware and let it sit for a few hours before you dump it out. It takes less effort, so either way can work. Does older tea tree guarantee a more sophisticated tea, or is it just a marketing of ancient tea tree to increase prices? So ancient tea tree definitely offers the tea more complexity in its notes, but also keep in mind it is not the older the better. What we're looking for is to catch the prime of a tea tree. So here's the thing: if you have if you know that you have a tea tree that can live for 100 years. Now you probably know at 5 years old is not this tea tree's prime, but also at the same time, at 98 years of old age is also not this tea's prime. So we're talking about ancient tea tree. We're still only looking at the vitality of the tea tree. It's just given that in certain regions in China, the tea trees have such a long longevity. So the younger tea tree just simply does not offer us the full potential of what this tea tree can offer us yet. So it offers more complexity, but more complexity is just potential. That potential needs to be realized in the hand of awesome tea makers. So just good ancient tea tree alone does not really result in the better tea, but it gives you the raw material for making the more sophisticated tea. And so right now in Yunnan, if everything else is the same, remember it's location, varietal, processing. So location is always key. It's the number one factor for price for any tea, right? So let's say everything else is the same. You are looking at about 5 to 10 times the price difference between a ancient tea tree versus a young tea tree, and you're looking at a very, very huge price difference between the ancient tea tree and the plantation tea trees. So it is a very big price difference. However, the tea of the made tea's age actually does not contribute much to the price of the tea at all. Usually the tea vendor will add a little bit of a premium for the inherent risk that associated with holding something for a longer time, right? But keep in mind, the tea price every year only increase because the labor cost and everything in China every year is becoming more and more expensive. It's not becoming cheaper. Because of that, if you bought a tea 5 years from now, that tea was actually much cheaper than the tea now. So the price that's associated with the age of the tea tree is much more valid than the price that's associated with the age of the made tea. I have had a really good Gu Shu pour from Myanmar, supposedly from a village bordering Yunnan. Yes, it's definitely possible. I know people who will go to Myanmar to actually look for these very old tea trees and then do them. But the thing is, that's always the thing, right? You look at the final volume of the tea in the market and the actual production of these desired tea trees, and you never have them matched. So that's why we train our palate to be able to distinguish these. And I wish one day we'll have a very robust labeling law. Actually, in China, you do have labeling laws as such, but it's just lack of enforcement. So I would say it's a work in progress, and then hopefully one day we can just look at a label and then trust it for what it is. Do you know what is white Longjing? Is it new variety or old? My friend gave me some the other day and like it. A white Longjing, that's very interesting because Longjing by definition is a green tea. So you can either have a albino variety that people have made into the Longjing shape. So albino varieties usually will have a lower astringency level. It'll be a little bit more umami, but it's also lack of the complexity that we're looking for in tea, especially in a Longjing. So Longjing by definition is a stir-fried green tea. So as a category, it's very strong, very robust. So if you use an albino varietal to make it, you kind of lose one of the reasons why people love Longjing so much, which is how robust the tea is. I would not think the white Longjing will be referred to the actual white tea, so like how we make white tea, because if they adopt the name Longjing, I would assume it'll take a flat shape, which is the signature shape of Longjing. And white tea, you cannot really involve shape making with white tea, and also during the whole white tea processing timeline, I cannot imagine a time when you would go and flatten the tea, especially given that this tea does not go on to high temperature, so it would not be as malleable as the other teas. So I would assume it's an albino variety. Do you like Taiping or Longjing better. So Taiping, Houkui, or Longjing. They're two very different style of teas. I definitely prefer Longjing, but that could be a personal preference. Well, one is Longjing. So if you grew up drinking tea, I think if you any Chinese person, Longjing is just the bona fide, the most standard taste of the tea, right? So the taste for Longjing is so standard, we basically can use it as a descriptor for all the other teas. And it's more robust, it's nuttier, it's very blunt. Taiping Houkui. So Houkui is actually a tea that's more savory, a little bit more umami, more floral. It's on the slightly thinner side. It has a little bit of a thinner line of expression in its note. So they're very different teas, and people definitely will have different preference around them. But I personally definitely love Longjing more. And also the making of Longjing is so amazing. So Houkui is very tedious, but there is some problem with the processing. How many grams per milliliter have you ever mostly drank? I'm not sure what that means. Do you mean like the maximum tea that you put in the gaiwan? So the standard size gaiwan like this one, the standard amount of tea that goes into it, the most is will be a oolong, or like a cliff tea, so it would be 8.3 grams. And then the size of this gaiwan thing is 110 milliliter. The brewed tea leaves are actually reddish in color. Is this an effect of the processing? It is supposed to be reddish. Because this is and you want it to be reddish. If it's greenish, that means that the tea was not fermented correctly. So this is the tea that's fully fermented, and also is fully oxidized. So the oxidation alone would have turned the tea into this brownish reddish color. All right, let me see. Is it true that is it true that some tea makers use animal fat to make Longjing? So there are some tea makers actually use fat to make tea, and it's not just for Longjing, for Houkui as well. But it's not animal fat actually. It's a grease that's derived from tea. Back in the days, people would put it into, it's like kind of disgusting. People would put it like almost like a soap bar, and then it had a little mash around it, and then they would just use it to rub the wok to kind of give it a light grease so the tea does not stick onto the wok. Now people use this powder thing, and this powder thing was developed by the China Tea Research Institute. And the last time when I talked to a researcher there, I was told it was a grease that's actually derived from the tea plant itself as well. So you can consider almost like a tea tree oil. But it has no aroma left anymore. China is a major tea producing country, but they also import to meet their internal demand. Yes and no. So I would not say China import to meet the internal demand, because the best cheese that China produce still is to satisfy the domestic demand. And in a way, on the volume level, it is enough. But there are Chinese people who are also curious about, Darjeeling, who are curious about Ceylon tea. So those are would be the reason why some of Chinese people also drink imported tea. But it's not because of a lack of the supplies of the domestically produced tea. If anything, China is one of the largest countries to export tea. So it's not a matter of not having enough supply to meet the demand, but it's more of a curiosity. If you're hungry, what can you eat with tea? What won't affect the way you taste the tea? I would say it'll always affect how we taste tea. If anything, I would probably recommend that you want to eat some thing before you go on to drink some tea. So that would be my recommendation. Having tea while eating, unless it's having the specific food pairing or some kind of taste exploration in mind, I would probably not recommend just doing this mindlessly, because then it will take away some of the nuance that you are gonna taste in tea. I find So the tea will be called Hou Kui, so it would be Taiping Hou Kui. I find Taiping Hou Kui more frequent than Longjing. Maybe try a different Longjing, because Longjing is actually one of the most frequent green teas, and it has a very signature kind of like a nutty floralness to it. Yeah, so maybe try a different one and then see what it is. But Hou Kui is also kind of frequent. It's different. It's more floral for sure. Would you avoid buying any tea in Chinese tourist area in mainland China? If you're in China, where would you recommend finding reputable tea shops? The short answer is yes. I would avoid buying tea from tourist attractions. Just keep in mind there are also some of the tour guide. That's that's part of their job. They'll take people to places to purchase tea, and then all those scheduled tea museum tour, and then people then sell tea to you. Those are all you won't be able to find very good tea there. For the tea, what they sell, you are probably going to overpay a little bit as well, but it's okay. It's usually not going to be over the top expensive either. So the loss is contained. But if you're looking for good tea, those will not be the good places to go to. I would say, in China, there are actually a lot of name brands, so large brands. If to save time, I will actually probably first visit those very large brands. They will have a more standardized taste, and for the quality, you again also going to pay a little bit more for it, but you're gonna have a baseline of quality guarantee, and also everything have a price sticker on it, so you can just make your own decision. If you can find the better tea shops, I would definitely recommend doing that, because then you're gonna have the better price and also for some really, really good tea potentially. But you can also have tea shops that's not very good. So you want to do some research prior going. Some of the really good tea shops do have a reputation. The owner usually will have steep him or herself in the tea region, have a lot of good knowledge about the tea. So it's hard to just kind of go to say generally where to go to, because these are the things that you do want to do a little bit of research on before you go. You can also, for larger cities in China, so either larger cities or a city that's close to a tea production region, you're gonna find these tea markets, or they call it the tea cities. So these are usually the wholesale hubs for tea. Potentially, you can find some vendors there that can offer you pretty good prices on whatever they offer. However, these places are usually huge, and you have to sort through them, and so in a way, you kind of have to spend some cost in terms of money and time before you can get to the real one. But eventually, maybe you can find some good ones. Are oolongs a choice of people throughout China? Are all these type of tea popular all over the country, or there are some local preferences? There are definitely some local preferences. However, China has been rapidly changing economically and also social mobility, things like that. So I have definitely seen more and more people able to appreciate tea that the region traditionally have not been appreciating. And oolong has been becoming increasingly popular. At the very beginning, when the green oolong was first invented, those were actually to satisfy or try to break oolong through traditionally green tea markets, which is largely in northern China and Japan, things like that. But nowadays, you definitely see people from all over China able to enjoy teas from all over China. It's still changing, but it's happening. We have 1 minute left. How many grams silver needle you recommend to brew in the 110 milliliter water and what temperature? So for that, I would recommend also 5 grams of tea. If you got a tea from Tea Drunk, it's just 1 packet, and use boiling water is fine. 95-degree water would be the more preferred. What kind of green tea, Korean tea, would you recommend? I'm not very familiar with Korean tea, so unfortunately I cannot give you answering that. But I have seen some pictures of some Korean tea garden. I'm very impressed with the biodiversity. I always find cheaper raw pour is more acidic than the expensive one. Is it right based on your experience? The acidic usually is due to some kind of over fermentation, which is not supposed to happen in a raw pour. But the cheaper pour, let's just say if it corresponds with the quality as well, usually you'll notice it's rougher and it has a lot of foreign aromas such as smokiness and then some kind of weird funky notes. What about Gongfu style? Is it common routine at home? Yes, depends on the region. It can be very, very common. All right. We're out of time. Thank you.